Good afternoon to everybody that's dialed into the webinar here. Welcome. First of all, my name's Tim Reed from SIPFA Property Advisory Services, and I'm joined today by Rob Whiteman, our Chief Executive, and we're going to talk today about regeneration. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping rules, just so we know that you can all hear us and see us okay. If you can, please click the raise your hand button, which I think is found on the small bar tab to your left. We'll know that you can all hear us and see us correctly. And while that's going on, and we can just get confirmation, because we've got IT in the room to help out should there be any disasters. I'm sure there won't be. But while we just wait for that to take effect and we hear back from you all that you can see and hear us okay, I'll just run through the format of the webinar that we're running this afternoon. So what you're going to get from today is effectively 20 minutes of Rob and I discussing regeneration. We've got our forthcoming regeneration conference on the 10th of July in Birmingham at the ICC, if you weren't already aware, and that's running alongside the main SIPFA annual two-day conference. So we thought it would be really good to discuss in a broad way regeneration and the role of local authorities. So we'll be talking for about 20 minutes. And as we go through a couple of questions, if anything comes to you that you want to ask, then do enter your questions to us, and I'll be able to see those. And at the end, we'll stop at 12:35, and we'll allow about 10 minutes for any questions that people may have. So that's the format, and I'm hoping by now people will have identified to us if there's any problems, and I don't think there are. So we'll get started. Okay, so good afternoon, Rob.
Hello, hi everyone.
So first of all, if I can just ask, assuming we're now out of the austerity period, which I know is a contentious thing to say, do you think that the role of local authorities as the agents and leaders of regeneration at a local level has changed? And if so, how do you think that has happened?
On austerity, it's just worth saying, I think the formal policy of austerity is over, where the government wants to make the state smaller. And so government isn't saying we want the smallest state as possible, but don't be lulled into a false sense of security, folks, because really we're going from a period of no more austerity to a period where we haven't got enough money. And actually the government will not promote austerity, but neither will it necessarily promote lots of spending. And in fact, in some areas it will still make cuts. It just won't call it austerity. It will say that sadly there isn't enough money. Regeneration is absolutely at the heart of what local government does, and there are several ways of coming at this from a finance or a community or indeed a regeneration perspective. And I think, Tim, that over the decades local government has learned quite a lot about what can work and what works less well. So I've got lots of grey hairs to show that I've been around doing this sort of stuff for a long time. I think we've learned that we want to avoid cliff edge regeneration, where we make big, new, shiny, gleamy things, but actually, cheek by jowl with it lives the community that hasn't been affected by that regeneration. And clearly, in an age where much of the public doesn't have trust and confidence in government institutions or in business, the sense that regeneration is for other people and not for us, and that we will continue to have cliff edge regeneration is just not acceptable. And so we have learned that regeneration, even when driven by spatial or infrastructure considerations, even if driven by the type of planning framework that we want to give and the type of area we want to see, or the type of infrastructure that we think is needed in order to promote that, whether that's transport or other things. Actually, regeneration is about communities, and how do you create a virtuous circle for your community rather than a vicious circle. And a virtuous circle is where people have the skills, the health, the housing, in order to be able to benefit from economic renewal. And because people have those skills, then actually the local high street can start to attract back some shops, and you can start to see things that only high streets can uniquely do rather than off-site retail parks. The vicious circle is where it works the other way. And actually communities can't get the jobs that come from regeneration. They can't get skilled up in order to be able to benefit. Actually, their local shopping areas and their local community feels as if it's still on the way down, and people can't get housing, and it feels like a very vicious circle. So I think local government's role in economic renewal is vital. It is at the heart of what local government does. More than any other local institution, whether it's health or DWP or academy schools or housing associations, local government uniquely has a role to see the community benefit beyond just the services that local government provide. Yeah. We have a duty to bring people together and ensure economic renewal. And I think that it's going to be tough because with perhaps the uncertainties of Brexit, perhaps the uncertainties of shocks to the economy as we readjust from one set of trading arrangements to another, there are risks for communities, and against that backdrop, councils want to make sure that any capital investment or infrastructure investment, the big partnerships, the big developments that it does for regeneration purposes, absolutely benefit the local community, rather than just being seen as an act of gentrification that won't benefit people like me. And if we fall into that trap, as we have fallen in the past, and I've personally fallen into this trap, if we fall into this trap, we won't be successful.
Thanks, Rob. And it strikes me, given what you've said, when we're talking about local authorities being best placed to deliver that and to take a lead, they're really the only organisations or the main organisation that's got that visibility across all the different elements of regeneration and can kind of pull all the strands together and see the bigger picture. I mean, we've picked 4 different areas in our regeneration conference around housing, infrastructure, economics and town centres, all sort of 4 key areas, and you've touched on some of those as we've spoken there. But there doesn't seem to be any other organisation that can pull all of that together. So it reinforces what you're saying, I think, about the need for councils to take the lead, because they are the only agent of change that can do it as effectively across the piece.
Yeah, and councils are very flexible bodies. So whilst councils have probably been hit more than any other part of the public sector in revenue budget terms, since 2010, local government has lost 50% of its government grant, or it's spending 25% less in real terms. Local government has the greatest capital freedoms of any part of the public sector. It can borrow money, it can do with its estate and its assets what it thinks is best for the community. And that can range from behaving in a very commercial way and thinking about the business and the bottom line. Actually, though, it also goes through to councils at times, sometimes thinking about the use of their assets for less than best consideration in order to work in partnership or to pump prime other things being possible by its range of partners. So local government displays or has the ability for a range of flexibility that most other public bodies can't do. And you won't find, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but you probably won't find health, housing, education, police bodies thinking about making use of their assets for less than best consideration for regeneration purposes, in that you will a council.
And I suppose, sort of having accepted the role that they've got and understanding that, you know, they're the catalyst in many senses that can help deliver that, and thinking about how central government views the role of local authorities. Do you feel that, you know, if it was a top-down kind of policy, do you feel that from the top they fully appreciate the concerns and the complexities at the coalface? Because for those at the bottom, if you put it in those terms, you know, the local authorities that are charged with delivering that, you know, when you think about whether they've got the tools to do the job and are sufficiently empowered to deliver it, given the austerity that we've endured, the loss of key skills and things like that, do you think that there's a adequate recognition that local authorities are going to find this difficult, and that they understand what the problems are and the lack of skills and the drivers to sort of help partner with the private sector? Do you think they understand that fully?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So actually, if you think about the conference, the Regeneration conference that we're talking about today, there's quite a range of speakers, from best practice on the ground examples through to what does government think. And so, for example, Richard Rowe from Trafford will be talking about the Altrincham programme, where developers, the council, the community work together in order to take Altrincham forward. On the other hand, we have Stephen Aldridge from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government that will give that view from policymakers about what's possible. I think the two are linked. Local government and the areas that we serve and the partnerships that we build, to some extent, are a normal distribution curve. And there are some places which are really good at this. There are lots of places in the middle that are getting better. And there are some places that are less good at this because actually they don't have the community links, or they don't have the local partnership links, compared to the really excellent ones that manage, as we'll see, to be able to do them all together. Of course, what government wants to see is that if it uses its leverage, if it regulates, or if it pumps prime with funding, or if it tries to remove some barriers, there is that local leadership to be able to make things work. And I think that in this period of, it's not austerity, but there isn't going to be a lot of money, I think that government will pick winners. And I think where government does try to help in its role, it's not going to back areas that it thinks are going to spend all their time squabbling, or don't have a clear narrative about what they want to do, or haven't arranged all the relevant partners or the community support to be able to do this. And over the years, I guess at that end of the spectrum, I've seen people use the process of a bid to try and build local alliances, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, I see people whose bids are successful because they've built those alliances long before they put a bid in. And it doesn't just look like partnership has been created as a temporary exercise in order to get some more money. It looks like there's real leadership, and it looks like people have got a real burning ambition to do stuff. So I think what we'll see at this Regeneration conference is really good examples from the ground and the case studies that you've lined up. But at the same time, from government, I expect there'll be a message that we're looking for places that have got leadership, that can really think that they can do something. And we're going to back winners rather than places that are squabbling.
Well, it'll be interesting. We've got Rachel Campbell, who's the head of Regeneration from Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government's local growth team. So she said that she will be talking about the best practice examples that she's seen in the area of high street and town centre regeneration across the piece. And one of those is Trafford and Altrincham Forward, who, as you've mentioned, we've also got speaking on a deep dive. So people will see what government thinks is good and how that's been delivered.
And can I just say, Tim, of course, meanwhile, the government is having to think about some really big things that we don't know what the answer to this is at the moment. The fact that a lot of businesses now trade on the internet, which means that you're at a disadvantage if you're locally based because you pay business rates. Whereas if you trade on the internet, you probably pay less tax in total. Government's having to grapple with that. And of course, local government is having to make submissions about fair funding and what we want to see. So I don't think we can pretend it's easy for government at the moment. They are seeing major societal changes in the way that business is organised, which actually is throwing into doubt, the basis of taxation that we've made for about 400 years in terms of what were rates and then business rates. And and now council tax and then NDR. So government itself has got some big lifting to do. And I think, as you say, from the Regeneration team at MHCLG, I don't think they'll deny that they're having to do some of this big lifting consideration. They're looking for people that have already got ideas assembled and that can hit the ground running.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of talking slightly, taking it in a different direction. I want to talk a little bit about partnerships, and it plays to some of the things you've already said about what we've said about the skill sets, and the need to build those really strong partnerships to be able to make the most of opportunities. And I'm quite interested to understand your views around partnerships between the public and the private sector, because we've got a lot of case studies that focus on that, good best practice at the conference. I mean, given the demise of Carillion and some of the negative publicity surrounding other private sector partners, how badly do you think this has affected the confidence of local authorities to work with private sector developers and to outsource generally in support of regeneration agendas?
No, again, it's a really good question. So there's no doubt that we need the private sector, and if we're going through a new renaissance at the moment, probably only the state can put the plumbing in, as I describe it. And if you think about the Victorian era and the great era of municipal investment, whilst you wanted businesses to flourish and you didn't want to manage capitalism, this is the government, only the government or only local government at the time could put the sewers in, could make sure there's clean water. And then the utilities came along, and only the state could make sure there's a network of gas or electricity infrastructure. Well, now probably only the state has a real interest in making sure that there's outstanding transport infrastructure everywhere. We need to put the plumbing in, and at the same time, the state undoubtedly has a role in making sure that there's a blend of houses, of affordable housing, as well as private sector housing, because I guess there's evidence of market failure, you know, to put it bluntly. The market isn't left unabated. The market isn't providing the type of housing that people need. And again, decent housing for everybody is sort of a bit like the plumbing. The state has to make sure that, you know, decent affordable housing is available, like it needs to make sure there's a transport infrastructure, or 100 years ago it put the sewers in. These big infrastructure projects are always going to rely on the best use of the private sector. Local councils don't suddenly want to invest in and develop their own building businesses in order to build a bridge or in order to build a tram system. We're not suddenly going to do that for 2 or 3 years, then make everybody redundant. We're going to make extensive use of the private sector to do the infrastructure and put the plumbing in place that we want, whether it's housing or transport or anything else. And I think there are risks at both ends of what I see as good practice. Definitely work in partnership. Definitely, when the going gets tough, help each other to overcome those problems and work in partnership. But at that end, I always say to people, remember there are some contracts here, and remember you've got rights, and you mustn't just be a pushover. At the other end of the spectrum, actually you see contractual arrangements in place where you need to say to people, remember you need to work a bit more in partnership. Yeah. Because if you just rely on the contract, you can undoubtedly make the private sector contractor go bust if you want to. Yeah. If you really want to force down prices and force down costs, you can undoubtedly put them on a knife edge if you want to. And however critical I am of companies like Carillion, particularly around the transparency of their books and how they finance things, there is no point in the state driving down costs on its main infrastructure projects to the point where people are going bust. Yeah. And actually we must use competition more wisely. So I hope that helps. I don't think there's a magic pill here. If you're just being the toughest contractual client there's ever been, you probably won't get all of what you want, particularly at the other end of trying to get benefits for the community. And you're going to have to really develop that spirit of partnership. If you are just a soft and cuddly partner, you've got to remember that there's contracts there, and that in times you have to enforce it. The good practice that I see are people that are a blend of the two.
Yeah, and leadership is, you know, key element of that ability to forge the right relationships, isn't it? And as you say, it's something that you know, shouldn't just be a one-shot occurrence. It's something that should be developed over time, that is safe and secure, that is for the long term, which is what a lot of our case studies focus on. So it's 12:35. We've been speaking for 20 minutes. We've still got a couple of questions to go if we need them, but I suppose it's chance now for people to send us their questions if they've got them. Don't worry if you haven't. We've got some time with questions that we can use. I can't see any at the moment on my screen, so I'll just double check. There's nothing that's there at the moment, but do please feel free to you know, this is your opportunity to ask Rob, you know, a key thought leader in the public sector and on this topic in particular. So do put your questions out to us, and we'll make sure we squeeze them in. But having talked then about partnerships, and you touched on some of the you know, the bigger stories around things like Carillion, and I think when we say infrastructure, and we've got Lord Adonis talking as one of the keynotes, given his previous role as the chairman of the government's panel on that. A lot of people think about the big ticket items, don't they, like HS2 or Crossrail, or the London sewer that we'll have all seen on telly, or even Boris's bridges, you know, the money that he thought should be spent on linking the UK mainland and Northern Ireland. But I think it's worth considering infrastructure at a local level, because for the majority of the delegates that are going to be coming to the conference, I think that's really where they're going to want to understand how they can have an eye to that, and make sure that they're doing what only the local authority can. Do you think that the sort of the localism agenda around regeneration and the small scale infrastructure projects that effectively are what build the vibrant, healthy local communities, do you think that agenda sort of taken a back seat and some of these larger scale headline grabbing projects have taken the limelight?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. So look, the bigger headline grabbing projects have to happen, but of course what tends to happen is that the politics of the government of the day that wants to do it tends to oversell one set of benefits and downplay the possible risks or unintended consequences. So on the whole, if you take something like HS2, I think that there are undoubted benefits for the Northern Powerhouse and the Midlands from doing it, and the government has always promoted that. On the other hand, the government's been uncomfortable at looking at the economic arguments that HS2 will make the London economy stronger, which it will, because actually London is this, there are two economies in the UK, on the whole, London and the rest of the UK, and actually greater proximity to London tends to mean that London will benefit by being able to attract in workforce and other factors. So governments tend to only want to give one side of the story rather than the balanced view of both. Going back to what I said at the beginning, local infrastructure is ideally about health, housing, skills, apprenticeships as being a part of that infrastructure as the fabric of the asset itself. If you look at the determinants of our health, for example, the treatment we get from the NHS is less than 20% of the determinant of our health. Very important, and we want to get good medical care, but statistically, our housing is just as big a determinant of our health. If people are living in damp conditions or polluted conditions or poor social conditions, actually that has a massive impact on their health and skills and economic outcomes. So, of course, how do local areas put together infrastructure projects which are going to be investing in the skills of the local workforce through apprenticeships, that are going to be working with FEs, as part of building the homes that are needed in order to make the area more productive, because more people have got good housing in order to be able to bring themselves to the workforce. Working on an industrial strategy or a strategic plan locally to make sure that the types of skills that you're equipping people with, you can attract businesses to do that. And around the country, you will see areas that say, we want to be famous for green industries, or we want to be famous for our transport links, or we want to be famous for micro digital businesses springing up. People have different strategies about the type of economic growth that they most want to see in those areas, and then that affects the investment in infrastructure. You know, do we really need digital connectivity? Do we really need transport? Do we really need homes? But it all links up, and local government at its best works collaboratively across the economic spatial area, not just its own boundaries, and make sure that these investments in assets are matched by investments in people in terms of their skills and their housing and their health, and that works not only for the council but for the FE sector, the NHS, and for local employers. So our job is to bring people together, and in a way that calls for a new skill set of leadership, doesn't it? Because public bodies that just want to act as the regulator, do it our way or not at all, or public bodies that have quite a strong sense of their own Bodicea-like leadership skills on a chariot without listening much to others or compromising with them or seeing what they need, are going to be less successful. We now need a cadre of leaders who are good at doing partnership, who are good at compromise, who are good at finding out what other people need, and are good at looking at this well-rounded picture of what local economic renewal means.
And that's a really nice segue into the last question we've got, and I think we've got just 3 more minutes, so we'll need to be brief. But given the role that they have and that need for leadership, something that we talk about quite extensively with our property network members and those that we work with, that need to have a strategy. You mentioned it there, investment strategy, economic strategy. And there being a danger that, being such a large organisation, local authorities can find it difficult to stitch together all of those different strategies. But that ability for the leader to set the corporate objectives and then ensure that there is a golden thread that drills down into all of those sub areas that are really pulled together at the coalface to effect that regeneration. It's important to have that ability to strategize and to draw that together, isn't it? So having a plan, having a strategy that links the top to the bottom.
So my favorite quote was Eisenhower. Of course, you have a military background. You would like this, where Eisenhower said, "Planning is essential, but all plans are useless." And I really think that's right. You cannot not have a strategy, because you don't know where you're going. And we can talk about the golden thread of what does vision, strategy, planning, policy, what do these different terms mean? But essentially, you've got to have a strategy and you've got to know where you're going. And 90%, that's what you've got to do. However, all plans are useless. And 10% of that may change. May change over 5 years, may change over 10 years. So you've got to be aware enough and flexible enough to not go in different directions, not to change strategy completely, but to reflect that you're not going to achieve through your plans what you want to achieve. And so you're going to have to trim them and go in a different direction. I cannot say enough that I think strategy is essential. And for finance folk on the webinar, I always sort of use the example of pension funds. When I was a young director of finance, I used to regularly sack my fund managers for not performing very well, and the shares were not doing as well as I thought they should, and so I regularly used to sack the fund managers. After about 5 years, I realised that we lost more on the investment strategy that I set them than actually their performance as a fund manager. We were losing more on strategy than we were on performance, because strategy is is key, and however important measuring performance and delivering it is, if you've got the wrong strategy to start with, you'll make far more mistakes and you'll go more materially wrong. Even if there's quite good performance against it, you will fail unless you've got the right strategy. So how do we all not turn strategy into something that sits on a shelf, nice glossy document, everybody then ignores it? Strategy has to be deeply rooted in that which we want to do, and then turn itself into a living document that people implement.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Rob. And yeah, my favourite quote is always, the first casualty of war is the plan.
Right.
So
yeah. I'll remember that one.
Well, that brings it to an end. Thanks again, Rob, for taking some time out. I know you're a very busy man, to just talk about your thoughts on regeneration. And for those of you that have listened in, thank you for taking your time out to listen into the thoughts that Rob had. And hopefully we'll see you at the Regeneration Conference on the 10th of July in Birmingham at the ICC. All the details are on our website. You just need to put SIP for Regeneration into your Google toolbar or whatever you use, and it will come up, and look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thanks.